Hey, this is Robin coming at you for Secure Mindset, the podcast where we think before we protect. Today, I have a new guest on for you, which is a surprisingly amazing story about crisis management during the Freedom Convoy in 2002 in Canada. He is the director of protection services at a major university in the near area of the where the convoy happened, and we're going to across in this podcast the lessons that are learned from dealing with that crisis at the point of time, dealing with the environment that was present, and the problems that arose from the crisis at that point of time. So I want to introduce my guest for today, the director of protection service, the director of protection services, Mr. Nguyen, and I want to welcome him on the podcast of Secure Mindset. So, hi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Robin. It's super exciting to be on with you. I've been following your content for a while now, and I just really love what you're publishing out there. And it's just a huge privilege to be connected with you today.
Thank you very much. One of the first questions that I like always ask my guests is, who are you, and why did you got there in the position that you're currently now in?
That's a great question. Look, it's if I go way back, back in 2003 is when I started my career as a Royal Canadian Mounted Police Officer. So in Canada, it's called the RCMP. So it's the equivalent of the federal police in Canada. I started as a patrol officer, so like you guys see on the streets, with a uniform and so on. So I did that for 4 years, patrolled the streets in the area of Vancouver, if you know where Vancouver is. And that's where I learned the job of policing. And then I was transferred over to Ottawa in 2007, where I became a bodyguard for the Prime Minister of Canada. So I traveled all over the world. I didn't end up in your neck of the woods, though, in my travels. But I traveled with the Prime Minister of Canada for 4 years. So at the time, it was Prime Minister Stephen Harper. So I traveled with him all over the world. And then in 2011, I transferred over to my dream job, which was counterterrorism. So I joined the counterterrorism team in 2011, and I did that for 6 years. So everything associated with counterterrorism operations here in Canada and overseas.
So that's a really extensive background, and I'm sure that most of the guests can learn a lot from you. So that's one of the reasons, of course, why I got you on here on Secure Mindset. But then you transitioned, of course, into your role at the major university in the area where the Freedom Convoy was taking place. So how did you make the transfer from your positions that you were currently in, then to the position that you are currently in?
Yes. So essentially what happened is in 2017, when I exited the RCMP, I decided to go in business for myself. So I launched my own business. I was a startup founder for 4 years. So operated my own business, and it was just an enormous opportunity to learn many, many things like managing staff and leading people and marketing and communication and selling. So I had to transition from being a police officer to a businessman. So I did that transition. And after 4 years, my company actually outgrew me. So I sold my business, and I wanted to get back into corporate security because I didn't want to go back into policing. I actually started looking around, and it so happens that one of my friends saw that there was a job opening at the university where I work, and essentially my friend was like, "Hey, this would be great for you. You should apply." And I'm like, "Oh, well, okay, that's not a bad idea." So anyways, I applied. It was a very long, arduous selection process. There were many, many, many candidates, and I was lucky enough to be the guy that got picked. So it's been just over a year and a half now that I'm the director of protection services at the university.
But then, of course, you transitioned directly into a major incident management perspective of the protection services on campus.
Yep.
So that was quite a challenge when you got started in, very likely. So how was being thrown there into the pit of this crisis then?
Um, it, I had a few months before the crisis started. So I arrived, in mid 2021 in my position, and the crisis started just after Christmas. So I just had enough time to get my feet wet, to meet with my team, to understand how the team worked, to fix a few things because there were a few broken things here and there that needed to get fixed or arranged. And by the time it rolled out, it was very demanding. It was very demanding for a number of reasons, because I was new in this position, and also because of the relationships of trust. Because when you're going into a crisis, trust is a huge issue. It's a huge factor to consider. Not only trust between, say, yourself and the people that you're supervising, but also from above you, right? The people above you need to trust that you're going to make the right decisions. And so at that time, those were all things that were very much in development yet. So there wasn't a full trust factor there. So that was, I want to say, one of the big initial challenges at the start. And I had to trust myself too, to be able to make those right decisions when it started. So if you want, I can start talking about a little bit about geographically where we're located and how it all started, if you want.
Yeah, let's do that. But before we do that, I think it's important to put out a disclaimer. Mr.
Yeah.
Yi is, of course, talking about his own perspective and his own responsibility and his own name and what he experienced. So we are not going to mention the university at by name, by full name, because of he is speaking from his own name, just to get it out there. So let's absolutely do it. Let's go into it.
Awesome, perfect. So essentially, for everybody who's listening in, just to give you an idea of the size and the location where we were. So Ottawa it's a fairly small city. Ottawa is it's not a huge city. It has a population of 1 million, so it's not an enormous city, but it has a fairly sizable downtown core. And this is where the Parliament of Canada sits. It's right downtown Ottawa. And our campus is literally a few hundred meters away. So it's not very far. So our campus is situated right in the downtown core of Ottawa. So our campus, what it looks like, it's just over 100 acres of property. We have just over 100 buildings on our campus, and we have more or less 52,000 people on our campus. So that includes students, staff, visitors, and you have to keep in mind there's a light rail train station that kind of comes through our campus. So we actually have a train station on our campus and so on. So lots of foot traffic in and out of our campus at all times, and vehicle traffic as well. So when this all started was in early January. So right after Christmas, in early January, there were reports. And let me take a step back here. Think back January of 2022. We were right inside the pandemic. So still, masks, vaccinations, lockdowns, everything associated with the COVID pandemic was full on at that time. In Canada, just like everywhere else in the world, there was a lot of dissent regarding the vaccine mandates, the mask mandates, and so on. Lots of people were supporting it, and lots of people were not supporting it. And some people were very dissatisfied with the whole idea of being locked down or being obligated to get vaccinated, or even losing their jobs if they weren't getting vaccinated. So there was a lot of turmoil in Canada in that regards, as in a lot of countries around the world. So early January, we started hearing reports that people around the country were starting to organize to protest the vaccine mandate. And so Canada is a vast, enormous country. Geographically, we're, just over 6,000 kilometers wide, if you look at Canada. It's an enormous country. So all over the country, there were these pockets of people that were starting to get together, and there was rumor that they were going to all drive to Ottawa to protest the vaccine mandate. At the time, it was very murky. We weren't getting a lot of detail as to what was going to happen. And at some point during the week of January 22nd, so almost a year to the date today, this is where on mainstream media, we were starting to see news reports of, we could see convoys of trucks, and they were saying, we're all heading towards Ottawa, and we're going to protest, and we're going to lock the city down, and so on and so forth. At the time, what was being posted on social media and what was being reported in mainstream media was wild. For example, they were saying, there's 50,000 trucks coming, and 50,000 people coming from Vancouver or from the Maritimes, and so the numbers were so outrageous that nobody, not me, not anybody, was really taking this seriously. Because for those who don't know Canada well, Canada is an extremely peaceful country. There's very little going on as far as dissent and things like that in our country. There's very little violence. It's a very peaceful country. So
nobody was believing it, basically.
No, exactly. When there were news reports of people claiming that there were 50,000 trucks to come and lock down the city, nobody believed it.
Nobody went. So crisis management structures, everything to accommodate that type of protest and that type of possible interruptions, violence, or disruptions, even in this case, the major logistical aspect of it as well, were not expected.
No, exactly. So the city, the police force in the city, the various government entities, and so on and so forth, everybody was monitoring this, but nobody was preparing for something massive. It happens. Protests happens once in a while, but nobody was taking this seriously. And if you look at the date, this was timed. This protest was timed to happen on a weekend, right? So people were thinking, worst case scenario, they show up on Friday. By Sunday evening, they'll all be gone because everybody has to go back to work, right? So if you looked at a map, and maybe Robin, you'll show the map that I provided.
I'll put it in there.
You'll see, guys. So the green part of the map is essentially our campus. That it shows geographically where this campus is located, and literally a 7 or 8 minute walk is the distance to where the protest occurred. So my mission at the time, the way I perceived this, was that my job was to make sure I kept the people the property safe, and more importantly, I wanted to make sure that my people, that our staff, while they were going to interact with protesters and so on, were going to be safe. So that was a big, big, big concern on my part. So
How did you prepare for that?
and so the first things we did is we got together, we sat down the whole team, and we made sure that everybody was fully briefed on here's the current intelligence that we have on the ground. Here's what we expect. Here's a reminder of our use of force policy. Here's a reminder of what we expect you guys to do if something happens. And what we obviously were doing is we were keeping close contact with the municipal police, so that if anything happened, they would be able to come and assist us. So in those first few days, once it started getting real, once we started seeing in the news media that yes, in fact, there were hundreds, not tens of thousands, but there were hundreds of trucks coming from all directions, from all locations throughout the country, people who drove actually almost 6,000 kilometers, but people who drove from all over the country to come and protest. And what was happening was, as the trucks were getting closer and closer and closer to the city, more and more and more people were kind of grafting themselves to this, because it's like a snowball effect. And the initial cause of protesting against the vaccine, well, all sorts of other groups with other issues with the government decided to kind of graft themselves onto this protest and bring their issues forward as well. And so what I think started as a simple protest grew probably outside of what the organizers of this protest were expecting. And so it's hard to explain the dynamic of everything that happened. But
so basically, it mixed between multiple groups got involved, and frustrations from not only just one side of the vaccines, of the COVID mandates, went combined, and went just a general focus towards freedom, towards government, towards general more political issues than just the mandates that were present at that time.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And to paint a picture, at that time, during that week specifically, the temperatures dropped dramatically. Like it got very cold. It went to minus 25 Celsius, and there was a lot of snow. So we were looking at multiple snowstorms. There were predictions for a lot of snowstorms. And when there's severe snowstorms, even on a good day, in Ottawa or any major Canadian city, driving around becomes very, very difficult. Traffic becomes an issue, and people can get stuck, and so on and so forth. So as this protest was getting a lot closer, this was getting real. So we started fully engaging with our team, making sure that everybody had all the information that they needed. And one of my main things was making sure that they had all the intelligence that they needed to make the right decisions, as they were going to be the people on the ground. So our concerns, for example, was that our staff may get stuck on campus because of a combination of the protest and the snowstorms. It was possible that our staff would not be able to physically leave campus. So we looked into emergency lodging. So we really knocked on all the doors and found places where our people could go and spend the night. We went out and found food, water, all that jazz. We just made sure that our team was able to work and not be stressed about, holy crap, like, what do I do if after my shift I can't go anywhere? Like, I don't want to sleep in my car. So so we were able to find emergency lodging. The other thing we did is we activated our emergency operations center. So essentially, it's a team of people. I'm part of the EOC, and it's
What's the acronym for that? EUC? Can you
the
define that?
EOC, so the Emergency Operations Center.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, and so the EOC essentially went into monitoring mode. This allowed us to communicate the situation with the whole community on campus, but mostly to brief upper management to make sure that they knew what was going on, and that if at some point we entered into crisis mode or something like that, that they were fully aware and then fully engaged into the decision-making process.
So were there any challenges or concerns that were present when you start developing this crisis management organizational structure? And there were of course, some places inside because you indeed had the emergency, the EUC in place. But what were the challenges that were coming up and concerns while developing the crisis management organization from scratch?
I'll be honest with you. We were running so fast at that point. I don't think I had time to stop and worry. But it was, we were realizing at this point, or I was realizing, I should say, because a lot of people were still very skeptical that anything was going to happen. But I had a feeling we were going to see something significant. So at that point, some of the bigger challenges, if you will, was that a big part of the communication at that point was about convincing decision makers that something was actually going to happen. Like this was actually going to happen, that we were prepared for it, and that they needed to trust us in making the right decisions. So there was a lot of communication at that point that occupied my time, while my team, lots of my team, like my executives and so on, they were, working up operational plans and so on. One of the things we decided to do immediately was to double our staff on the ground. So we called everybody on overtime. Everybody we could find that could come in on overtime, we called them in. And one of the things that I organized with my team was that I recognized that we would need to run our team, bring it to the red line, literally run our team as hard as possible for the shortest amount of time possible. So we were hoping that this would only last 3 days. Like I said, that they would arrive on a Friday and then leave on a Sunday, and hopefully we'd be done. So we had the whole team in for those 3 days. But what I tasked my team with was, we have a plan for 72 hours. Let's make sure we have a plan for 1 month and 6 months, because I had no idea how long this would last. And I knew that we couldn't run our team redlined for 3 months. There's no way, because everybody would burn out. So I wanted to make sure that we had a plan in place so that our people, although we were redlining, that at some point we would be able to scale back and make sure that all our people could go home, rest, and come back to work in a healthy manner. So lots of things happened at that time. So we had the EOC, as I said, that was activated. We were closing parking lots and so on, because we didn't want some of our property to become rallying points for protesters, right? We didn't want those parking lots to become like campgrounds or anything like that. So we completely shut down parking lots and so on and so forth. Modified building accesses as well. So most of the buildings are usually public access. People can it's a university. People can walk in and walk out. But considering what was going to happen, we decided to lock the buildings down and restrict them to card access only. So you could only enter the building if you had a swipe card to go in. So those are the types of things that we started doing prior to the arrival. So I don't know. Do you have any questions up to now?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, go.
Did you like? I know that in Canada, they use ICS, so the Incident Command System, as a general, and it's a derivation of NIMS, so the National Incident Management System out of America. Did you have something like a crisis structure in place within the campus in order to delegate the roles, responsibilities, and
Yep.
set up things like operational periods?
Yes. So that's exactly the role of the EOC. So the Emergency Operations Center, that's exactly its role. So it's essentially the crisis team of the university. And so it's composed of myself, the person in charge of protection, but there's also an emergency management person there. There's people from upper management that are part of the EOC, but there's also people from the facilities department, the IT department, the communications department, and so on and so forth. So it's a full team that deals with the crisis as it occurs.
Awesome. That is, but that must be quite a managed perspective. Like the major challenge, of course, with these type of situations, maintaining a good span of control. So, for people that don't know what a span of control, optimal span of control is the amount of persons you are able, as a leader, to direct and have a subordinate and a leadership position without losing the control of the organization and without the stream of information. So within that, how did you manage that span of control?
Well, from the beginning, once I took charge of that team, one of the things I really worked on was making sure that I was delegating command as much as possible. So, in the terms of extreme ownership, it's all about pushing responsibility down the chain of command. Um, Initially, when I arrived on the team, lots of people, for example, were in a and they had been coached that way, but they would not make a decision. They would just ask their boss, and the boss would ask their boss, and they would ask their boss, and so on. And so no decision was being, or very few decisions were actually being made at a frontline level. And once I started, the first thing I did was push decision down the chain of command. So making sure that everybody knew what exactly their job was, what their powers were, and what we were expecting of them. And so I clarified all these lines of communications, lines of accountability. And so we have a fulsome structure on our team, just like in the military or in the police force. We have an org chart, a hierarchy, if you will, where everybody understands exactly what they're responsible for, what they're accountable for, and where they can make those decisions. And of course, in a crisis, nothing's perfect, right? A crisis is messy. It's everybody's doing the best that they can with what they have. And it's happened a couple of times, right? Where somebody literally on the front lines would phone me directly and go, "Hey, I'm seeing something change currently. The picture's changing. I want to redeploy my resources in such and such a manner." My only answer to that person was, "Your call." It was that person's decision to make, and my person just went, "Yep, awesome, perfect," and he made the right
Just
call.
did it.
Yeah, he just did it, and he made the right call. So, to address span of control, I think that we had that locked down before the protest arrived. So I think everybody was fairly clear on their responsibilities and so on and so forth. And because we had all hands on deck. It was entirely possible for us to kind of think our way through this, even though things were happening really fast. At all levels of the organization, people were making the right decisions. So it made it easy for us.
And really effective. Like I know that like the span of control, especially when delegating operations in such a matter, can be really challenging. If I take a personal perspective, if I take a draw from my points of experience with search and rescue, I see within the Netherlands we have a lot of trouble with dealing with that span of control, and I see like here a mismanagement problem that often arises here is that we have one search manager trying to manage 40 resources
Too much.
in order to. It's not possible, and it's because I don't know. I know that a lot of schools don't have a proper crisis management structure like ICS in place, or or an IMS structure. Both same thing, but a different name. So, how would you recommend if anybody from school is listening and they recognize, hey, I don't have a crisis management structure? How would you start with implementing that?
Wow, that's a big question. I would say that the first thing that they need to understand is they need to go through a simple tabletop scenario just to get the feeling as to what a crisis is and how messy it can get and how fast it can get messy, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so by getting that feeling, by getting this experience of being exposed to a fake incident, they'll quickly realize that, okay, we need a structure in place. And then, based on their experience, they can effectively put a strong structure in place. There's many organizations just like yours, Robin, that help out, post-secondary, private corporations, government, and so on and so forth to set up these crisis management systems, because they're dramatically important. And as I go on in this presentation, you guys are going to realize that even though we had a good structure in place, an excellent structure in place, I want to say, lots of things went wrong. Lots of things went wrong. And it's just, you want to try to avoid as much damage as possible by not having a structure in place. So I would recommend the first thing to do would be to take your whole team through a tabletop exercise, like a mock incident on your property or in your buildings and so on, just so that you can experience the stress, the drama, the losses that you're going to take during an incident, and then realize, okay, here's how we need to structure this, because then it'll make a lot more sense for you than to do the other way around, right? To try to build a structure and then try to game the structure into a tabletop exercise. It's not going to make a lot of sense for you to build that structure if you don't know what you're doing. Even if you're getting a consultant and so on, I would really recommend starting with a scenario based experience.
Awesome. Thank you for that amazing answer. Like, I see so many mistakes, especially like people that are coming into a crisis and start recognizing, hey, I'm in a crisis, but I don't have the proper structure in place to deal with that. So,
Yep.
thank you for that, because it's amazing. We need to put out a structure before we head into a crisis.
Yep.
And that's one of the major problems, of course, that we deal with as security professionals, as crisis managers, to try to convince them, indeed, like you mentioned earlier,
Yep.
the higher staff, so executive directors or other personals of influence, hey, we need to make this before we get into the problem.
Yep. 100%. And at the end of the day, if it were me, if it were my organization, or if any organization were to ask me, what should we be doing? my first question to them would be, what's your appetite for risk?
Mm.
Right? What are you willing to risk? Because at the end of the day, that's really what it boils down to. So one organization, one post-secondary organization, whatever, um, will have different types um, of appetites for risk or tolerance to risk, right? And so if we say, for example, and this is just purely hypothetical, but let's say, for example, your organization has lots of chemical products, highly toxic chemical products, and there's a chemical spill on your property, and people are going to die because they're going to breathe the chemicals or so on. What's your tolerance to risk? If you don't have a structure, and let's say it causes 89 deaths and 300 wounded, and the catastrophic closure of your business, say for 6 months, as opposed to, say, having a structure in place where maybe you'll have 6 deaths, 34 wounded, and you're back up and running within 6 weeks. It's that appetite to risk, right? Some organizations might say, we're so comfortable saying this will never, ever, ever happen that we're not going to invest into a structure, which, by the way, a structure isn't really costly. It's just organizing yourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But other organizations will say, no, you know what, we are going to do the maximum to make sure that we're fully organized so that if ever something like a chemical spill would happen, then we're able to respond quickly. We're able to keep people safe as fast as possible, maybe rescue the injured as fast as possible. And then there's all the business continuity component to this where, it's going to affect your business and your bottom line very, very quickly. And so how fast can you cycle back into being back to full operations? And so having a structure will help you do that. And again, it's a conversation about risk tolerance at the end of the day.
All right. So, thank you for that. That amazing. So, how did that conversation of risk tolerance went when, of course, the protests are starting to arrive on the January 28th? Because you had to do a lot of preparations. You had to secure the parking lot. You had to inform students, very likely. You had to set up the EUC.
Yeah.
So, how did the conversation, of course, then went into your organization?
So I'm not going to go into the detail of who said
Mm-hmm.
what, and the what the positions were within the university. But what I can tell you is that at that point, everybody was concerned about what was happening. But to be honest, it wasn't real yet. Like, the protesters hadn't arrived yet. So people were kind of just holding their breath. Everybody's just like, maybe nothing's going to happen, right? And so if you want, I'll just keep going into the protest there.
Sure.
So on the Friday, so it's Friday, morning, 10 o'clock in the morning. It's January 28th, and this is where protesters start arriving in the city of Ottawa. And there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people arriving. And so now it's real. Now we're seeing all these people arriving. And what we are noticing on our campus, because we're right close to this area, is that we're seeing lots of foot traffic. Lots of people walking through, lots of people on the streets, many, 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 many more vehicles than we're used to seeing. So lots of traffic jams in and around our campus, and so on and so forth. And one of the things I asked my front line was, I asked them to continuously report what the mood was, because to me, that's what was going to be the indicator as to how this was going to go. And for the first, that whole Friday, lots of people, lots of protesters, lots of noise, but no problem.
Hmm.
The information I was receiving from my front line was like, hey, no, you know what? It's like a party. It's like a winter party. Everybody's in a good mood. Everybody's happy. Everybody's showing up. If we're telling them that they can't park here, they're not all rude with us. They're just like, okay, thank you, and they just leave and they go somewhere else, and so on and so forth. So the information I was getting from my front line at that point was that yes, lots of people on and around our campus, but no problems whatsoever. Everybody was fully cooperative. Everybody was nice to our staff. So I was like, well, this is best case scenario, right? So that Friday into the night, I mean, we're on high alert, and what we do is we relocate the large part of our resources to the west side of our territory, if you will, so the west side of campus, because the Parliament Hill, where all of the protesters were going, was located 300-400 meters west of us. So we relocated most of our resources west so that if ever, for any reason, the protesters were going to spill over and come towards our campus, we would have advance warning. So the Friday goes by really, really fast. Into the night, there's huge parties on Parliament Hill. The whole area is locked down. There's just so many people on the streets. It turns into this giant street party. But there are no issues. And so now we're into January 29th, the Saturday. So this is where the protest actually begins. And so we end up with I think it's around 15 to 20,000 people who are gathered in the core of downtown Ottawa. Again, we're on high alert on campus. We've got all our people. We're like we're double staffed. We've got people everywhere. And our mission at that point remains, we're really focused on keeping, campus safe, our campus community safe, and keeping our staff safe as they're interacting with the protesters. And the way I'm monitoring this thing from my position is I'm trusting my frontline people to do the work that they're supposed to do and report up any type of issues. But what I'm doing is, and I don't know if that's available to you guys in the Netherlands, but in Canada, in most cities in Canada, any citizen can go on the city's website and have access to the traffic cameras. So what I was doing is
We do some bits here in the Netherlands. We do have that option, but that is valuable. I don't know many people who do it actually, but there are some places that are open to it. Indeed.
Okay, perfect. Well, so this is accessible in Ottawa, and so what I was doing is I had a screen that was just open for mainstream media. I had a screen that was open and all I had were traffic cameras. Another screen was our cameras, so our own security cameras. And so I had all these multiple screens around me, and I was keeping an eye on the streets, on what was happening on Parliament Hill, and I was also monitoring social media. Because during that protest, what was absolutely phenomenal as an intelligence tool was the fact that there were all these streamers. There was about, I don't know, maybe a dozen live streamers that were broadcasting what was happening on the street 24/7. They were just walking around with their phones and just live streaming everything that was happening. So you could see minute by minute how the crowd was growing and the mood and who was where. So it was an incredible intelligence tool. And so one of the things, and this is where there's a big lesson that's coming here, is that there started to be on that Saturday, there started to be a huge discrepancy between what was being put on mainstream media, so that the main TV stations, the main news broadcasters in Canada, what they were portraying, as opposed to what was on social media, there started to get like a big gap there.
So
And
they were basically so a highway that was splitting up, and they're like starting even dissonance between like mainstream, what means the framing that mainstream media wants to portray
yep,
what was happening, and the framing that was from the people's perspective what was happening.
yep, exactly. And so what was interesting, so on that first day, and I can't explain why it happened that way, but usually when there's an event, just like anywhere in the world, when there's an incident, something big's happening, within minutes, mainstream media, journalists show up, right? Reporters will show up on scene. They've got cameras with like their trucks and everything, and they're filming the whole thing, and they're asking people questions, so on and so forth. On that Saturday, not one mainstream media was present on the ground,
Interesting.
which was
Very
super
interesting.
bizarre. And so it was interesting because I was like, that's so odd that we've got all these social media streamers like walking around the protest, filming everything, and all of the major news broadcasters, all they had were like helicopter shots and stuff like that, but they had nobody on the ground. And I was like, I don't know.
Do you think that they were scared to come to the
I
protest or
don't
not?
know.
Because
I don't know if they were scared. I don't know if they made like a corporate decision to maybe not publish too much of what was happening to encourage more people to go. Like, I have
Mhm.
no idea. But for some reason, it felt like at the onset, because it wasn't all throughout, but at the onset of this, there was no media on the ground, which was
Interesting.
super bizarre. So, um, all throughout the Saturday, I mean, big protests, noise, everything. Um, it gets very rowdy in the downtown core of Ottawa, but on our campus, everything's safe, everything's secure. We're not seeing any types of incidents, and things are well. We're good. we're we're uh,
Mhm.
we're cruising through this. Of course, in my position, I'm fielding a ton of questions, right? Lots of phone calls from upper management and so on and so forth, asking for updates, asking for this, asking for that. A lot of what I was getting was, well, should we be doing this or should we be doing that, and so on and so forth, which it's all legitimate questions, obviously. But in my role, I was fielding a lot of these questions, a lot of these calls as this was happening on top of managing my own team. Um, and then, so we go into the Saturday night. Again, another giant party now. I mean, there's bands that are showing up. People are setting up stages. There's fireworks. I mean, this turns into like probably the biggest party Ottawa has ever seen. So it's this giant party. And the Saturday closes. We've had no incident on campus. There's been very few incidents in the city of Ottawa as well. There's been a few reports of assaults and things like that. But considering there's like 20,000 people down on campus, or not on campus, but in the city core, it's there's very little happening.
But that must be a major crowd management perspective for you as well, because that's of course something that you probably had to deal with. Did you have any preparations for that too, or you
Um,
had just rolling with the punch that you had there?
yeah, so we didn't have to do a lot of crowd management per se because the crowd was really 300-400 meters away. So we did have barriers on standby if we needed to block some areas with barriers and so on and so forth. But the reality was that if we had this tidal wave of people descending on our campus, which our campus again is huge, it's enormous, it's over 100 acres. There's no way to stop them, right? There would be no physical means to stop them. So what we would have to do is we would have to manage it in a way that we would keep our people as safe as possible, and we would try to direct the protesters down specific areas as best as we could. But we're not. Our team is not a police force. Our team is not an army. So there's
No.
no way for us to. There would have been no way for us if thousands and thousands of people would have literally descended on our property. There would have been no way for us to physically stop them. We could have directed, we could have negotiated with them and so on and so forth, but it would have been very challenging. But we were very lucky that that didn't happen. So for us it was again a big learning point. There was there was a lot of discussion as to should we start putting barriers up? Should we, have police cars, requests for police cars all over the place, and so on and so forth. And my initial reflex, and which turned out to be the good decision at the end, and I was lucky with this, but it was better to hide in plain sight than it was to
Mm.
get all lit up like a Christmas tree, and then start attracting protesters, right? Because we have so much property in the downtown area, if suddenly all of this property was surrounded by barriers and fences and trucks and police cars, I think we would have attracted attention, and people would have started to try to confront us because we had these
Mhm.
barriers. But because we left everything open, we just hid in plain sight. We were just part of the scenery, and people didn't.
How did you come to that decision then? Because that must have been quite a conflict within yourself. Like, try to, like, we can all either become as much as a castle as possible, like lock everything down, have strong presence, maybe hire private security to lock down entrances at specific areas in order to have a little bit of crowd management in place. But then, yeah, that must have been quite a fight in yourself.
Yeah, it was actually, it felt like a gamble, to be honest, is what it felt like,
Mhm.
because it's damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of decision. And the It ended up being the right call, because there would have been, at that point, it was too late. It was too late to say we need enough fencing for the whole campus. Like, there, I don't think there's enough fencing in the whole city
Available.
to fence off our property. And the reality is that even if we were able to find some of those temporary fences, these things will hold back a crowd for a whole 45 seconds, right?
Yeah.
Like, if a crowd is dedicated and they want in, they're going to come in. And so getting these little fences would have barely slowed down a dedicated crowd, right? So my position was that it's better for us to not try to spend all our resources, spend all our money trying to stop a hurricane with a
Mm,
toothbrush. It's just there's
yeah.
just so little we could do, that I was like, no, let's just hide in plain sight. We're just going to make it appear that it's business as usual for us, and fingers crossed, people will leave us alone, which is exactly what happened. We've had throughout the whole thing, we had zero issues with people going onto our property and breaking things or assaulting people on our campus or anything like that. We had zero, none of that. So we were very lucky.
So
So essentially,
that must have been
going into the Sunday. So the Saturday, as I said, big huge party and so on and so forth. But then Sunday is when things really started turning for the bad for us and for the city, really. And what was happening was the crowd, I guess, was expecting that somebody would go talk to them, right? That somebody from the Canadian government would engage with the protesters and some type of negotiation or at least conversation would take place. But that didn't occur. And so the mood of the protesters, because now they'd been there for 2 days, right? And so now the mood was starting to sour a little bit. And one of the things that started happening was what was being reported in mainstream media and what was happening on social media and what we were seeing on the ground started to completely diverge. Completely. So on that Sunday in mainstream media, like I mentioned, lots of groups had grafted themselves onto this protest. Some were, let's call them far-right protesters. And one guy started walking around with a flag with a swastika on it.
Oh.
It was not good. Absolutely not good. But it was one guy, right? Out of the, say, 20,000 people that were there. And I'm not sure what he wanted to say with his swastika because, he had other flags with him, like F Trudeau and other flags with him. So, on the one hand, you could interpret the swastika as saying that he's part of a far-right Nazi-type group, or his message was that the government were Nazis because they were forcing people to get vaccinated and so on. So regardless, there were a few people with questionable flags or signs or whatever in this protest. And the mainstream media started solely focusing on these people. And so the mainstream media started reporting that Ottawa was being invaded by a far-right group that were racists and so on and so forth, and that they were assaulting people and that they were defecating on the streets. And so there was all of this really nasty reporting that was coming out of mainstream media to make the protesters look really, really, really bad.
So they had their own agenda, basically, in mind.
Yeah, clearly the mainstream media had a very specific aim to make the protesters look really, really bad, to paint them in a very, very bad light. And on social media, everybody, we started losing control completely. And for example, on our campus, there were various incidents because, it's a huge campus, so there's always stuff going on. But some people decided to post things on social media blaming it on the protesters, saying, there's a protester that just broke into our residence and we had to chase him out and blah, blah, blah. And so, so now mainstream media would pick up on that and headlines would be, the the campus of the university is under siege by protesters. And so like it started creating this panic. And so our people were out there investigating these incidents. And for example, the case of the protester breaking into a residence, for example, a student residence, was absolutely not a protester. It was actually a homeless person that we were very familiar with, that regularly breaks into our buildings, that we actually escorted out of that building. So it was complete false information, but it was just a constant stream of these posts on social media, kind of saying that things were spinning out of control. While when I was talking to my frontline people, it was still status quo. Like the protesters were still very nice with our staff. There's no problem. Nobody was parking or damaging anything, or we were having zero issues with the protesters. However, social media was exploding with all of this fake news that now we were playing catch up. Instead of controlling the narrative as things were going and issuing information, we were behind the eight ball. Like we were continuously trying to catch up. And on mainstream media, you had all of these reports that were coming out about Nazis and far right and people getting assaulted and just the nastiest stuff. So a general panic started in the city at large, where people were like, oh my gosh, we're under attack, and so on and so forth. So
the media made it worse.
Oh yeah, it was just, and literally, it was a complete fabrication, because there was very, very little issues during this protest. Yes, of course there were issues, but not to the scale that was being pushed out in the media, and not to the extent that that got published. So again, it's a big learning point for me that when you're going through a crisis, it is critical for you to trust the intelligence that you're receiving and to verify what you're getting. So if you're basing all of your intel on what's being published in mainstream media, you're in trouble. If you're trusting only your frontline, or you're trusting only social media or whatever, it's a massive mistake. You have to consider all streams of intel that are coming in, and you have to be very detached from the information and look at this from a distance and say, okay, what's actually happening now, and what's my next best tactical move? In that situation, that was a huge learning point for me, was that you really need to consider where you're getting your information, because at some point it just becomes an avalanche of information, and you're being asked to provide information, right? You're briefing upper management, you're briefing all sorts of people, so you have to be careful what you're reporting, because if, for example, I only started reporting what was being said in the mainstream media, technically I wasn't painting a correct picture, right? So that was a major point. One of the other big learning points here for whoever's watching this is we didn't have any communications templates. And so it meant that we were continuously rewriting and writing some more about for updates and this to the community or to upper management and so on and so forth, which ate up a ton of time, right? You're at some point in a crisis, you're doing 1,000 things all at the same time. Everybody is overtasked and working like crazy. You can help yourself out by having things prepared in advance. So having communication templates ready ahead of time to say, okay, this is a template for, say, updates and so on and so forth, where you can just plug in information and make it quicker to disseminate. Having that set up ahead of time would have saved me so much time and energy.
Mm.
So that's one of the huge takeaways from that crisis for me, is having communication templates made ahead of time. And today we have that. We've built those.
Awesome. Do you think that like organizations need to look at their pre-plan and like not only do the tabletop exercises that they have, but also look at the pre-plan? Okay, if X happens, so protest happens on campus near near Parliament in this case, then we need to have X, Y, Z basically.
Yep. Yeah,
Or
exactly. And I think that when you're pushing your team in that thought process, it it you start asking the questions as to, okay, well, who needs the information, when do they need it, and what, how much of it do they need? And so once you start developing those templates, it becomes very critical to say, okay, well, how much are we putting in there, and how much is expected, right? Because everybody's different, and so one person may want, like, oh, I want it all. I want all the information right now, and other people are like, no, just give me the snapshot. Just give me what I need to know, right? And so it's about having that conversation to understand who needs to receive, the communications, and what needs to be in there. So it's a huge learning point for me. Some other things that we didn't do that should have been, done a lot better, is we needed to have somebody dedicated to managing social media from the get-go. Like, not somebody that does that on the side. Like, we needed to have a full-time crisis communications person on social media from the onset. From that Friday, we should have had somebody in there, because, as I mentioned previously, as soon as things started exploding on social media, we were just playing catch up, as opposed to us posting on social media, interacting on social media, and being ahead of the story. While, so if people were starting to post pictures of what was happening on our campus, for example, or things like that, then we would already be talking about it, and people wouldn't panic, and people would go like, oh, okay, this is what's happening, and so on and so forth. So that would have been a huge help. The other thing that, again, even though we had clear structures, one of the things that wasn't clear was who on the protection team was the dedicated communication person, and who in communication team was assigned to talk to protection, right? We didn't have these people defined. And so what happened was, the communications team is a large team. They have multiple employees in there. And at any given time, we would have 1, 2, 3, 4 people contact us separately, asking us the exact same question, but they would contact different people in the team, who these people would start scrambling on their own, trying to find the information to get back to the comms person. But that was such a waste of energy and time. And it was the same thing for us, right? Sometimes we had information we needed to communicate to the comms team quickly, but we didn't know who to call. So we would just like email everybody or whatever, right? And it's just, it was really inefficient. So a big learning point there was, when you enter crisis mode on your team, there should be one person assigned to talking to communication team. And then the communication team should have one only person. Sorry. Should have only one person,
structure in place.
Just that one person to communicate with the protection team, because then the information flows and it's not duplicated or triplicated, right? And the speed at which disinformation happens on social media is stunning. Like, we're talking minutes. You don't have hours to respond to something, you've got minutes. And so having a really efficient comms team is gold in a crisis, and it shouldn't be underestimated. And that kind of takes me into one of my biggest lessons for this crisis, which is it's super important if you're in security and you're dealing with a crisis. It's super important to be flexible with your mission. You need to be able to reassess at some point. In the industry of law enforcement, military, security, we tend to be very narrowly focused. We get tunnel vision, and we're like, "This is my mission," and you're just sticking to it, and you're just like, chomping.
You're biting in it. You're not letting loose.
No, you're not letting go.
Understandable.
And that's dangerous, and that's a mistake. And a good example.
Why is that dangerous?
A good example of this was when. So as we entered this third day, right, and this is, lots and lots of things happening downtown Ottawa. Lots of things, incidents, this and that. All police getting involved in all sorts of stuff in downtown Ottawa. But there was nothing going on our campus, nothing at all. We had maintained total control over our space. Everything was going well. However, the problem was a huge issue with stress, anxiety, fear. That's what was the enemy on our campus. People like students, staff, various people, not all, but a lot, were very, very scared. Some, for example, some employees didn't want to come into work. They were scared. Some students didn't feel safe on campus. They wanted to leave. All that stuff, right? And so I quickly realized, on day 3 that my mission had to change. We had to change from a, protect at all costs kind of positioning to a reassuring position. So we brought our teams back in, recognizing that there wasn't a physical threat to our campus. There was no indication that we weren't going to get one anyway. So what we started to do was, instead of having this picket fence of security guards all over the place and just keeping an eye out for any protesters, what we started doing was we pivoted. We started going into student residences, walking around in buildings, and just reassuring people. I had my staff, all of my staff, walking from building to building to building 24/7. And they were just engaging with students and staff, guests, and reassuring everybody that, everything's all right on campus, everything's safe, there's no problem. If you need our help, you can call us, and so on and so forth. And then the mood on campus went from really, really hyped, to, the pressure started coming down, because we realized quickly that, we really weren't helping our community by being out there, with the, just with our guard up and just ready for a fight. That there was no fight to have. And so we pivoted and really helped our community that way. And that's a huge learning point, is that you absolutely need to be flexible. You need to be able to look at your current mission and say, okay, well, does it still reflect what I'm seeing on the ground? Does it still reflect the actual tactical position that we're in right now? And clearly it wasn't for us. So we changed, and it paid off tremendously.
That's good, very good. Because like the major thing, of course, with when addressing and dealing staff, like comforting them, is like also giving them supplies, possibly to keep them feeling well. How did you manage that? Because did you have any resources on hand to comfort them? Did you have maybe handouts? What are the resources that you had available to comfort the people that, like the students on campus or and staff on campus?
Well, fortunately, we're an extremely large campus. So we have an enormous amount of resources on our campus from, student life teams. There's all of these student support groups. There's staff support groups as well. There's mental health support on campus. We have a campus clinic. So we have all of these resources that are available on campus. So it was really useful because all of these resources were activated during that time, and they were there to help people on campus. So we were referring people continuously to these resources so that they could benefit from the resources. One of the things that played into our hand, we were lucky, is that it's the fact that it was the pandemic. So usually there's 50,000 people, 52,000 people on our campus. Now there was, a few thousand on campus because most of the classes were being done online and so on and so forth. So most of the students were not there. Most of the staff was working from home, that type of stuff. So even though, we still had thousands of people on campus, we didn't have 50,000. So our problem wasn't as big as it could have been had the campus been full.
How did it affect you? Because during that, of course, and especially handling that, you got lucky with that people not being on site. So that's very amazing. But how did you deal with specific concerns that were? Because there must be people that are coming towards you directly, especially international students, I think. Did anybody approach you personally on that, and how did it affect you in a personal way?
That's a good question. That's an excellent question. I've had not a ton of people approach me directly. I had a few, and most of the people that approached me directly, it was more questions of of a logistical concern, like people who we were noticing that our staff were getting really tired, right? They were outside in minus 25 temperature for 12-hour shifts, sometimes 14-hour, 16-hour shifts. That wears on the body, right? And so we were starting to see fatigue on the team and stuff like that. So when I was being approached, it was for concern for the staff or concern for a specific person that we'd be like, okay, we probably need to pull that person off the line and send them home so that they can rest. And because we have people that are parents, we have people that are have some physical conditions or whatever, and it's just everybody's got their own thing, right? And it's important to manage that, even if it's a crisis. You have to be able to recognize that some people can go harder than others. The feeling that I had, to be honest, was pride. I was super proud of how my people, like everybody on my team, was just working so hard, and everybody was stepping up to the plate. Like in a time of crisis where people could have easily said, you know what, I'm not coming in for overtime. I'm not doing this, whatever. Everybody came in. Like everybody was put their shoulder to the wheel and pushed. And I was super proud, and they were doing a phenomenal job out there. So for me, it was a real feeling of pride. And it was,
Amazing.
when you're in a position of leadership, you have to manage your own energy level as well. So I was being very careful to, try to get as much rest as I could when I could, and let my team work and not just be micromanaging everything. Just like
Mhm.
let the team work, look at the strategic picture, and so I was managing myself a lot at that time.
What types of, because you're mentioning a little bit of self-care, did you have any other practice of self-care during that position that you were in?
Well, for me, it's mostly in crisis. For me, it's staying hydrated is a big thing. Like when you get very stressed and you're running all over the place, you stop drinking. And then that's so.
Mm.
Stay hydrated. Eat well. It's easy to grab junk food and stuff like that, but that will not fuel you for the long run. And so I was always really careful to get good, healthy food. And I have to admit, maybe it's because of my age, but I like to nap. So I take naps. And so anytime I could squeeze in a little 15-minute nap here or a 10-minute nap there, that I would do it. Like I would just go and lay down and pass out for 15 minutes, and that would just recharge the battery, and then I'd be ready to go again. But those are kind of the little tricks.
The little
Yeah,
nuggets, little ticks of the trade. Um, Thank you very much for your assistance and consideration, especially when dealing with this crisis at hand. I think that staff especially on students, we may not even know that you're in that role participating. They should be, I think, from my perspective, very grateful that you and your staff did what you do to achieve the safety and security for the sites on campus. It's one of the mottos that I have within my own security companies, like for life and property, and I think that you definitely embodied that during the crisis that you had at hand. Do you have any last considerations, things that you want to give to our audience?
sure. There's we touched on it a little bit, but plan, 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 plan. So in our industry, we tend to try to minimize things, right?
Mm.
Whether we're in the military, police, or security, we tend to minimize things, and we're like, that'll never happen. That'll never happen. And so, you know what? Previous to this huge protest in downtown Ottawa, which ended up locking down the entire downtown core of the city for months. Um, Nobody would have ever believed that this would have happened before, right? And so it's important to drill it. Like even if you're only doing it
Mm.
once a year, plan for it. The airports plan for aircrafts to crash on the runway. If you're running an organization, whatever type of organization you are, plan for whatever, an active shooter or an earthquake or things that are really far-fetched. Just run it as an exercise just to see if you're ready, because it'll really highlight things that you've never thought about. And in our case specifically, although there was never any situation where we would have needed to evacuate, but as this thing dragged on, one of the subjects that came up is, well, what if we need to? What do we do if we need to evacuate parts or all of the campus? Like we need to move our people, everybody out. How would we do it? And there was no plan. It just highlighted the fact that there was no plan. And a good example of this is, let's say, for example, you have to move 5,000 people, which, it's not that many people. But think about it. If you have to move 5,000 people, where are you going to put them? In a
Mm.
stadium? In a shopping mall? In another university? What are you going to do, right? And so it just highlighted the fact that you're like, okay, well, physically we need to put them somewhere, and at that physical location there needs to be water, washrooms, heat, that type of stuff. And so suddenly we started kind of tabletopping as we were in this crisis. At some point we kind of tabletopped an evacuation just to see, okay, well, how are we going to run this, and to realize how many gaps we had. And so we were able to plug those gaps afterwards. But you need to really run those scenarios, just even if you're saying, okay, let's tabletop an alien invasion or whatever, like even if it's far-fetched. But
how you deal that?
yeah, but it will highlight where you've got huge holes. And for example, one of the big holes we had was we didn't have transport. Like, it's a university. There's no university bus service, right? We don't own buses. And even if we had buses, let's say you have 10 buses, you've got 5,000 people to move. You can fit 50 a bus. So how many trips do you need? How fast is that going to happen? And so that highlighted the fact that we needed to have an integrated plan with the city transport company, with law enforcement, with other universities, and so on and so forth, to say, in the event that we need to evacuate, we need to have a clear plan. So the lesson here, just to wrap this up, is plan for the apocalypse, plan for something terrible, and game it, just to see if you can figure out where the holes are. And again, I'll just finish with this: is in a crisis, you need to control the narrative. So do not underestimate the importance and the skill needed for your community or your communication team during a crisis. Extremely, extremely, extremely important.
Thank you very much for being on Secure Mindset, and with that closing statement as well. So I want to quickly summary throughout the main key points that we had throughout this podcast and the valuable things that we learned. So of course, prepare, plan for everything, even if it's an alien invasion. Basically. As much as that is unrealistic, it might be a good tabletop exercise to see, hey, where are things that are possibly going wrong? Second lesson learned, of course, is integrated communications. To have integral. So what positions we are going to give to another, not to do double work that we are required. So having one person assigned to the position in order to not have double work, in order to have communication errors, and also I think that maybe a point that I learned from you today is that you can trust on intuition when something when particularly when you mentioned the part from decision being made on putting up barriers, yes or no. And thank you very much for being present on Secure Mindset. I want to also come again forward that you can find Nguyen on LinkedIn. I'll make sure to put the link down in the description, and of course in visual. So if you have any questions regarding the podcast, you can go and contact him using LinkedIn. So with that closing statement, thank you very much again for being on the podcast. And for the audience, don't forget to think before you protect. Protection, rescue, and lifestyle. This is Robin, and we are out.